This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ed Sullivan. I am the founder and CEO of Trust Exchange. Trust Exchange is a business information platform, a sort of social network, a new type of software that enables companies to connect, exchange, and collaborate related to business information. What we're going to talk about today is how, in this new world, the networked world, businesses can increase trust by creating custom social networks, collaborate with their third parties, their customers, their vendors, or partners, and solve fairly complex business information problems using Trust Exchange. So my name is Ed. If you need to reach me or have any questions, you can contact me at edsull, EDSULL, at trustexchange.com. You can follow me at Twitter, on Twitter at edsull, and our corporate Twitter is at B2B Trust. I started Trust Exchange based on an idea I had while at ARIA Systems, where we were in a fairly highly regulated industry, the payment space, and we had a lot of large clients that depended upon us, including companies like Disney, Sony, American Express, DreamWorks, Comcast, etc. And they needed information from us on a fairly regular basis to validate that we were safe, secure, met requirements, met best practices, and that frankly they could just trust us to manage their data. So the problem that businesses have today and have had historically is that engaging and tracking this information is fairly complex. It's actually more complex than you realize in a lot of cases. The market today is over $100 billion that businesses spend to check on each other, whether it's credit reports, business information in general, GRC, et cetera. It's a big problem, and it's being solved with linear solutions, people, spreadsheets, et cetera. So they're not efficient, they're reactive, and the way that they assess a company, are kind of the standard ways. Hey, I'm going to look at your spreadsheet or your balance sheet, or I'm going to look at a report. All of those things are focusing on past performance. They're archaeology. It doesn't tell anyone what's going on right now. So for instance, if you're trying to figure out if your child is sick, you don't look at a temperature from last quarter or last year to determine whether or not they're sick now. You take their temperature now. So what's happening is that businesses are, driving taxis in an Uber world. And the technology is out there, our platform included, that can help companies see around corners, see what's going on in their ecosystem, see what's going on with their key customers, their key vendors, et cetera. So one of the failures is that people think about things as pipes or change, my supply chain, my pipeline, et cetera. Information between businesses doesn't travel in pipes, it travels in networks. Then because of the connectedness of the internet and the dependency that companies have on each other today, this business information is accelerating. The amount of information, it needs to be validated, it needs to be checked, it needs to be reviewed, just adds to the problem. Here's a simple 5x5 companies interchanging information with each other, and this assumes that there's 3 interactions, that time is static, it doesn't move forward, and that all of these interactions are successful. So even in the small matrix here, it gets pretty complex fast. The other aspect of it is a validation problem. So even if you collect the information, and a lot of companies that are in highly regulated industries are required by law to collect the information. How do you validate it? So I would argue that one of the problems that's out there is that not only is it a collection problem, but the bigger problem is a validation problem. is this information true? How do I validate it? Where do I get that validation from? Is it an internal member of my team? Is it a third party, maybe an auditor, an accountant, an insurance company? Or is it the honor system? So what Trust Exchange is, it's a collaborative platform. So the collaborative economy has grown dramatically over the last 10 years, but largely among consumers. Businesses have been slow to adopt this, but the common denominator among these companies, Uber, Waze, excuse me, Airbnb, et cetera, is that they collapse the layers between the creator of a good or service, and the consumers of a good or service. So with Uber, as an example, you no longer need to hail a taxi and wait for to call the dispatcher, set an appointment, have somebody come pick you up. You can on demand put your phone, put in a request, and have a car come within less than 5 minutes in a lot of cases, in most cases. Similarly for Waze, where it uses the power of the crowd to determine what's going on in your network. So one of the cool things about network effect and collaborative economies or collaborative platforms is that you can have networks and sub-networks. An example would be, I live in Philadelphia, so it's not going to poll me and what's going on in traffic here in Philadelphia if it's trying to figure out what's going on in Chicago or Miami, et cetera. It tracks the people on the street there. So one of the advantages of using a network effect platform is that you can cluster networks, cluster sub-networks to get answers to problems. Another advantage is that it often solves adjacent problems as well. Looking at Waze, not only does it tell you what's going on with the traffic, it can reroute you, it can tell you what the price of gas is, and also help you avoid the police. Some other things that happen that are beneficial to companies is the digitization of that industry. So if you think about the digitization of hailing a cab, you used to have to call somebody. When you got in, you paid, got a receipt. Most of the time, you had to pay with cash. Another component of this kind of disruption is dematerialization. So we were talking about receipts and cash, but to find out where traffic is, they would put a helicopter in the sky. In fact, some still do. Put a helicopter in the sky, fly over the main highways, and tell you what the traffic was on that highway. It didn't give you the secondary and tertiary roads. It didn't give you what's going on in your neighborhood. Didn't tell you where the police were. And furthermore, you probably had to tune into the radio at a given time every hour to find out what the traffic was. And if you happen to miss that time because you're listening to a song, you could end up driving into a bad situation. So demonetization, I already talked about. So demonetize means that the costs go down. You don't need to put a helicopter in the sky. You don't need to pay a pilot, buy the helicopter, fuel the helicopter, et cetera. So digitize, dematerialize, demonetize, and then also democratize. Being able to get the smart people out on those streets to submit the information. In our context, that the smart people on the streets might be experts in accounting for vendors, experts in insurance for third parties, so on and so forth. So being able to democratize that information with crowdsourcing, but not just random crowdsourcing, using smart crowds to determine the specific information you need for your solution. So Trust Exchange. So this is how we work to collapse all of these layers. So with our platform, our clients would go in, create a network. They can make it secure. They can make it public. They can customize the network, bring on the players in the network, and enable them to exchange information. They can input procedures, policies, best practices, and get everyone on the network to comply with those best practices and policies and procedures and rules. So with Trust Exchange, you can build a network, bring in the parties, create the rules, and then the network almost runs itself. So we think that not only does it solve this problem, but also gives opportunity to the network creators and the network partners to create a marketplace for business information. We're talking to, for instance, a partner that sells, that wants to be a broker for personal protective equipment, and being able to create a buyers and sellers network, bring third parties onto the network that are validating transactions, making sure the contracts are legal, make sure that the contracts are legal based on the location, a sub-network, right? Pennsylvania, California, et cetera. But then have third-party validators come in and validate that the supply meets standards, validate that this PPE is for OR certification, et cetera. So that's what Trust Exchange does. And it enables you to zero out all of these different layers that would normally exist in the same way with Uber, where they've knocked out cab drivers and medallions and dispatchers, et cetera, by using technology. We can do the same thing, but we can do it for a custom network that you design. So interestingly, this actually was stolen or borrowed from a presentation about Uber, where they create a virtuous cycle. Once they get leverage, once they start getting transactions happening, the quality of the product gets better, the quality of the network gets better. Then more contributors come. The more contributors that come, the faster information there is, the less wait times. And having slow wait times for Uber is good, not just for riders, people looking for rides, but also for drivers. And in fact, it's not just good, it's necessary. And the lower those wait times, the more demand there is, and the better quality it is. And then the prices go down, and the better. And it ends up building this flywheel that is what they call a virtuous cycle that helps everybody in the network. And we're experiencing the same thing in the networks and sub-networks that we're creating in different verticals. Once we get into a vertical, we bring in some contributors. The more contributors there are, the better information there is. The better information is, the more demand there is. As that information continues to get better and more contributors come on, the cost of getting this information goes way down, like 80 or 90%, maybe even more. We think that the other thing that happens is that you get more contributors on here that have information, because the cost of getting in the network and providing the information goes down as well. So I don't need, like in banking, for instance, the audit, the SOC 3 audit, or the financial audit for data security. I don't need to hire somebody and pay them $20, $50, or $100,000 to do the audit once a year, when I can use the smart crowd of contributors to the network that give you higher frequency, higher contrast information that's better than last year's audit. Here's a quick overview of the platform. The platform consists of pretty simple user interface, kind of like a social network, kind of like Facebook or LinkedIn, et cetera. But we have an administrative overlay in dashboards and policies. So these dashboards allow the people that create the network on our platform to create rules, put contributors into different categories, and stack rules in each category. The rules can be logically connected with ands and ors, and then stacked on top of each other. Each company that comes in, each contributor would come in, has a company profile with a timeline. They can populate that timeline with the key events. Hey, here's, rather like Facebook, the event might be, here's a picture of my kid, whereas on our profile, it might be a facilities inspection, or a report, or an audit, or proof of insurance. So all of these events are customizable, and they can also be validated by third parties. So the events can also be designed to be an internal event for the owner of the network, where they may want to have their team review something and do the validation. These validations can happen through verifications from third parties. For example, in the pharma industry, we've integrated with the FDA, we've integrated with state websites that have information around vendors and third parties in that space, so that we can take that data from third parties via an API, pull it in onto the timeline of that business, and validate that those transactions occurred. And finally, how do we get the information out? There's multiple things. Number one is the dashboard. There's alerts that are live on the dashboard. There's robust reporting, where you can create reports, design reports, look at things, what's going on in different date ranges, which of the contributors have been in compliance with the rule set, which ones haven't been in compliance with the rule set. and you know, we have banks that use it and use our reporting engine for their monthly board report on third-party risk. We have farmers that use it, and here's the risk report of their supply chain, which of their suppliers were compliant with their rules and best practices, and which ones were not. So I'm going to go into a couple of use cases and how they work. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat section of the GoToMeeting. On my screen, it's the bottom right. But if you just go in, enter your questions, and at the end I will answer the questions. So here's a couple of use cases. The first use case is banking. So banks, obviously a highly regulated industry. One of the key problems that they have, and one of the kind of hot buttons for regulators over the past 5 years or so, has been third-party risk. Banks have notoriously not been very effective at monitoring third parties and monitoring key third parties that might be storing data off-site, may have access to buildings. So banks are required by law and regulation to monitor all third parties in a risk-appropriate way. So it's a pretty difficult problem to solve. As if you're a bank and you have one vendor, or 10 or 100, collecting this data weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually is very time-consuming. And we provide a network that allows the banks to create the rules, the vendor management and compliance teams at each bank to create the rules based on best practices, government regulations, et cetera. The vendors would join the network. They would subscribe to the rule set and submit the information or the reports or the validations required in order for the banks to get that information. What makes this kind of even more powerful if we get a series of banks joining the network and sharing the information with each other. So open sharing between the banks and open sharing between the vendors, which helps both sides of the table. If you're a vendor and you have 10, 20, 100, or 1,000 banks as your client, submitting this data, getting these inbound requests from the banks is burdensome. And as you can imagine, if you have 1,000 bank customers or 100 bank customers, they're asking for things from you at varying frequencies. With Trust Exchange, you can make sure that every bank client has the proper information on the right date, has up-to-date information, et cetera. You can broadcast that information to all your vendors. Let's say you just got a new certification. The vendor can put it out on Trust Exchange and all of their client banks can see it as soon as it goes out. So some of the ways that our bank clients save money is, so keep in mind, it's like a social network. So once a vendor is on there and a bank is on there and they're sharing information, when bank 2 comes online, it's like adding friends in a network. You don't have to re-enter all of the information. Sharing that information, collecting reports, collecting the data, it reduced their cost by 60%. They were able to recapture capacity, sometimes up to 3 or 4 full-time equivalents that they were able to repurpose for revenue-driving practices versus back-office practices. And then finally, they were able to get A's from the regulators. A lot of these banks and community banks and credit unions don't have the resources to, do what a big bank like Bank of America would do, and they struggle with the problem, and they get hammered by the regulators. So we were able to take our client banks, and they would go from struggling to getting an A+ in the class from the regulators. Now, interestingly, there are a couple of adjacent, as I mentioned before, there are a couple of adjacent problems that can be solved here. And for instance, in this case, we were able to help some of our clients solve the PPP forgiveness process from the CARES Act. We were to help some of our clients do loan portfolio review in the COVID explosion. Excuse me, when companies were kind of going out of business, missing payments, some of our clients were able to go in, create a network of loan portfolios, bring in third parties to manage those for them, do audits, knock on doors, talk to people, and figure out what's going on in that network. And then finally, we have a couple of partners that do cannabis compliance for banks. So cannabis-related businesses need banking services. They need merchant accounts, take credit cards, they need bank accounts so that they're not storing cash, et cetera. And it was a big challenge for them. And a couple of our clients worked with banks in the compliance states to figure out ways that cannabis-related businesses could be in compliance, make sure that there's no illegal activity, and then that all of the transactions were auditable, safe, and secure. The next use case is in public safety. So we're working with several companies. We're working with several organizations, cities, communications companies, building managers, county managers around public safety. The first key application is fire safety. So imagine you're a fire marshal and you have 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 buildings in your town or city or county. You're responsible to make sure that each of those buildings is up to code, compliant with fire safety, et cetera. It's a very difficult job. It's hard to do. And what a lot of the overworked fire professionals do is that rather than inspect 100%, what they'll do is they'll inspect the highest risk buildings, schools, hospitals, nursing homes, factories, et cetera, and then trust on the business owners and building managers to make sure that their business, the fire protection, the sprinkler systems, et cetera, are all inspected. A lot of that information is pieces of paper stored in a file, usually inside the building that's on fire if there's a problem. So with Trust Exchange, we're able to build these custom networks in a town, adjacent towns across the country that gives them better compliance, digital transformation so that everybody on the network can see the information, radical transparency. They'll know proactively what's going on in the building. They'll know when they're going to an emergency what's going on in that building. Let's say, in one case, there was an example that was given to us where the system was turned off for maintenance because there was a repair being made and they were waiting for a part. They could see that right away as they're going to the fire, and also increase compliance. So some of the adjacent problems that we were able to solve, one of them is COVID reopening. So when a town wants to create rules to allow businesses to open up, create segments of businesses, and create this network effect, our platform is perfect for that. Creating a network in a town of businesses, inspectors, township employees, city employees, county employees that are validating and revalidating the information. They can set the frequency. I want to make sure if it's a daycare center, I want to make sure that it's cleaned daily and that before it reopens, you need to make sure that the fire protection was inspected. So that's an example of a way that our system can be used to solve adjacent problems that were not the original intent, but very valuable nonetheless. And finally, this is kind of a cool emerging network that we're working on our platform in partnership with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, University of Pennsylvania, University of Kentucky, where there's a network of veterinarians and pork product manufacturers that want to track diseases on pork farms throughout the country. So build the network here rather than firemen, inspectors, and buildings. It's veterinarians, pork producers, and pork farms. They create the rules in the platform and they monitor them. And it's a lot better right now. The way that they're doing it in a lot of places is they're seeing the data maybe weeks or a month or so after it hits. They can't see it in a consolidated view. We make it real time, digitized, reduces the cost. A lot of times they have this analysis being done by very highly compensated people, doctors, vet techs, et cetera. And the data is redundant. So they're touching the things 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, 10 times in order to get the correct information into the correct hands. So it's increased safety, increased security of the supply chain for pork products. So those are the 3 use cases. If there's any questions, happy to answer them. I see there's a couple. So the first question is pricing. So it's usually the first question when I do these, but basically the way the pricing works is that depending on the industry, depending on the size of the network, we would give you a quote. So it's the basic model is setup fee, and then we charge per the number of people on the network monthly. And then also, if there's like a third-party integration, like integrating with the FDA or integrating somewhere else, then that would be a fee as well. The range, we have some networks where it might be like $100 or $200 per month per client, and then we have other networks that are in retail. For instance, we have a fairly large retailer that uses it where it's a several $1,000s per month. Another question: implementation time. So it's really interesting. It's really interesting, this question. So the implementation time goes down with every new node on the network. So imagine if you're a bank and you're tracking your 100 vendors, you would call the vendors up, ask them for their information, track it in a spreadsheet, vendor 1, vendor 2, vendor 3, so on and so forth. Bank 2 is probably doing the same exact thing. In our network, our ability to create networks and subnetworks, Bank 1 comes on, adds all the information, invites the vendors on. The vendors add all of their information. Bank 2 comes on, they have like a 50% overlap with the same vendors. And we're finding this industry by industry. So once those vendors are online, the amount of time it takes to implement this goes from, what might be several weeks to months for one of our competing vendor management software to where it's taking an hour or so to get everything set up and configured. So let's see. So another question: cost of management on an ongoing basis, and what would an ROI be? So I think one of the so a lot of people focus on the price versus just like what is the overall value. In a prior slide, I was talking about like capacity recapture, which is a huge number for a lot of these banks and in the pharma industry, where they're able to recapture capacity and repurpose that capacity for other transactions, where they're not in a paper chase of tracking forms down, calling people. They can manage by exception, at a glance, see what's going on in their ecosystem, and they're able to solve the problems quickly. And in some cases, the ROI is pretty big, especially in the highly regulated industries, banking, pharma, finance, etc. Any other questions? So how can you find out more information? Well, if you go to trustexchange.com/demo, there's a form there that you can fill out, and someone will get back to you quickly. Alternatively, my email address is edsull, EDSULL, @trustexchange.com, and also send me a direct email or go to the demo site. If you go to trustexchange.com, there's other use cases and things that are out there. And then finally, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I will record I am recording this, and I will also put the slides on our blog section of our website. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.